36% of the homes on Cape Cod sit empty most of the year, not abandoned, owned, furnished, insured, property taxes paid. They belong to people who live somewhere else and show up for 6 weeks in July and August, maybe a long weekend in October, and then vanish. On a winter Tuesday in Wellfleet or Truro, you can drive through entire neighborhoods and not see a lit window. The median price of a single-family home on the Cape has passed $750,000, which means you'd need a household income of roughly $220,000 a year to afford one. The median household income on Cape Cod is less than half that. So the people who actually live there, the teachers, the nurses, the firefighters, the cooks, increasingly don't. They drive over the bridge from the mainland, work a shift, and drive back. And the bridge they're driving over was built in 1935, is rated functionally obsolete by the Army Corps of Engineers, has 10-foot travel lanes with no shoulders, and can be shut down by a single car with a flat tire. This is the most popular vacation destination in New England. 5 million visitors a year, $2.8 billion in direct spending, and it is consuming itself. But the strange part, the part that makes this story unlike any other, is that Cape Cod was never supposed to be a place at all. It's a pile of sand. That's not a metaphor. Geologically, Cape Cod is glacial debris, a terminal moraine, the rubble pushed south by an ice sheet 2 miles thick during the last ice age, roughly 18,000 years ago. When the glacier retreated, it left behind this curved arm of sand and gravel jutting into the Atlantic. Everything that has ever happened here, every fortune made, every home built, every fight over zoning, every traffic jam on Route 6, has happened on a temporary deposit of sediment that the ocean has been slowly reclaiming since the day the ice melted. The Pilgrims were the first Europeans to notice. On November 11th, 1620, the Mayflower dropped anchor off what is now Provincetown. They spent 5 weeks exploring the outer Cape, foraging for food, skirmishing with the Nauset people. And then they left. The land was too sandy, too exposed, too isolated to support a colony. They sailed across Cape Cod Bay and founded Plymouth instead. It's one of the great ironic rejection letters in American history. The most famous settlers in the New World took one look at what would become some of the most expensive real estate on the eastern seaboard and passed. But the Wampanoag people had been living on Cape Cod for thousands of years before any of that. They called themselves the people of the first light, and the name fit. This narrow arm of land catches the sunrise before anywhere else on the Massachusetts coast. They fished, farmed corn and squash, hunted deer, harvested shellfish, and built dome-shaped homes called wet-to-wash from wooden frames and woven bark. Their relationship with the land was intimate and sustainable in a way that nothing that followed would be. When the English settlers did arrive, starting in the late 1630s, the Wampanoag taught them how to strip blubber from whales that washed up on the beaches, how to plant in the sandy soil, how to read the tides. Sandwich was incorporated in 1637, Barnstable and Yarmouth in 1639. The first settlements clung to the bayside along an old Wampanoag trail that is now Route 6A. They were compact, cautious, built low to the ground against the wind. What happened next is one of the oldest stories in colonial New England. The settlers stripped the forests for lumber, pasture, and firewood until the Cape was nearly bare. By 1800, firewood had to be shipped in by boat from Maine. When Henry David Thoreau walked the outer Cape on 4 visits between 1849 and 1857, he described a landscape so treeless and wind-scoured that it looked more like a desert than New England. He noted approvingly that Cape Cod was wholly unknown to the fashionable world. He also predicted, with considerably less enthusiasm, that the time would come when this coast would be a place of resort. The economy that sustained Cape Cod for its first 2 centuries was built entirely on the ocean. Cod, of course, the fish so abundant that Bartholomew Gosnold named the entire peninsula after it when he arrived in 1602. mackerel, haddock, shellfish, and whales. Shore whaling began almost as soon as the English arrived. The Wampanoag methods adapted and industrialized. By the early 1700s, Cape Cod whalers were among the most skilled in the colonies. In fact, it was a Cape Codder who taught the Nantucketers how to hunt whales, a historical footnote that Nantucket has spent 3 centuries trying to live down. Provincetown and Wellfleet became major whaling ports. In the 1840s, upwards of 50 whalers sailed from Provincetown alone. The oil lit lamps across America and lubricated the machines of the early Industrial Revolution. But whaling was a resource extraction economy, and like all resource extraction economies, it carried its own expiration date. By the mid-18th century, nearshore whales had thinned out. Voyages grew longer and more dangerous, pushing into the Arctic and the Pacific. And then, in 1859, Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Petroleum was cheaper, more abundant, and didn't require a 3-year voyage into the Southern Ocean. Whale oil prices collapsed. By 1870, whaling in Provincetown was in terminal decline. The Cape also had a salt industry, vast wooden evaporation vats called salt works that lined the shores and produced salt for curing fish. At its peak in the 1830s, Cape Cod's salt works produced hundreds of thousands of bushels a year. But mined salt from deposits in New York and elsewhere undercut the price, and by the Civil War, the vats were rotting. Fishing continued, and still does. Lobstering, scalloping, oyster aquaculture, and the fleets out of Provincetown and Chatham still bring in over $2 million a month. But it was no longer enough to sustain entire towns. Here is the critical turn that shaped everything that followed. The Industrial Revolution mostly bypassed Cape Cod. The rest of Massachusetts, Lowell, Lawrence, Fall River, New Bedford, was transformed by water-powered textile mills, shoe factories, machine shops. But the Cape had no significant rivers, no water power, no raw materials except sand and fish. When the maritime economy collapsed, there was no industrial economy waiting to catch it. The population fell by nearly a third in the half-century after 1850. Towns shrank. Young people left for Boston, for New York, for anywhere with a factory job. And so Cape Cod did something deliberate, something that tourism historians consider one of the earliest and most successful pivots in American economic history. It decided, consciously, to sell itself. The instrument of that transformation was the railroad. In 1848, the old Colony Railroad reached Sandwich. By 1854, the line extended to Hyannis, where passengers could transfer to ferries bound for Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. The islands, in fact, got a head start. They launched promotional campaigns before the Cape did, and for a while, Cape Cod suffered from what one historian called an image problem. It was still thought of as a backwater, a place of poverty and wind. But the railroad kept pushing east. By 1871, tracks reached Wellfleet. On July 22, 1873, the first train arrived in Provincetown, and 800 people showed up for a celebratory luncheon on High Pole Hill. One speaker compared the Cape's fisheries to Chicago's grain market. The railroad would do for codfish what the rail hub had done for wheat. He wasn't entirely wrong, but the real cargo turned out to be people. Once the train connected Boston and New York to the Cape's beaches, everything changed. Local homeowners began renting out spare rooms. Boarding houses opened. The resorts and hotels came next, modest at first, then increasingly grand. The Chequaset Inn in Wellfleet, built in 1886, sat on a wharf over the water and was unlike anything else on the peninsula. The Highland House in Truro capitalized on Thoreau's fame. You could stay where the great writer had stayed. The East Bay Lodge in Osterville opened its doors in 1886 and lasted over a century. The Santuit House in Cotuit had been welcoming guests since 1860. These weren't Newport mansions or Saratoga palaces, but they were a new kind of economy, an economy built on scenery, salt air, and the promise of temporary escape. The first attempt at a true luxury resort on Cape Cod was the Hotel Chatham, and it failed spectacularly. Opened in the 1890s, it was too remote, too hard to reach, and too expensive for its moment. It spent more years shuttered than open, and was demolished in 1910. The irony, 2 years later, funds were raised to improve the road to the old hotel site, just as automobiles were arriving. The second attempt, Chatham Bars Inn, opened in 1914 and is still there. A stockbroker named Charles Hardy, who had family ties to the Cape, bought a piece of bluff overlooking the Atlantic and built a hunting lodge for wealthy Bostonians. It had soundproofed rooms, steam heat, private bathrooms with the choice of fresh or saltwater baths, tennis courts, and a 9-hole golf course. Hardy understood something essential. The railroad had made the Cape accessible, but it was the automobile that would make it irresistible. You didn't need to follow the train schedule anymore. You could come when you wanted and leave when you wanted. Meanwhile, at the tip of the Cape, something entirely different was happening. Artists were arriving. Charles Webster Hawthorne, an American portraitist trained in New York, came to Provincetown in 1899 and opened the Cape Cod School of Art. He taught thousands of students over 3 decades, preaching the gospel of painting outdoors, of letting color make form. Provincetown had everything an artist needed: cheap rent, welcoming locals. The fishermen left their extra catch on the docks for painters who couldn't afford dinner. And the light. That famous Provincetown light, refracted by the water on all sides, shifting from silver to gold to pink in the space of an hour. The fishing boats in the harbor, the dunes, the weathered shingles of the old buildings. It was a landscape that practically demanded to be painted. When World War I broke out in 1914, artists and expatriates who had been working in Paris and London suddenly needed somewhere to go. Many of them ended up in Provincetown. The Boston Globe in August 1916 declared it the biggest art colony in the world. That same year, the Provincetown Art Association was founded, a collaboration between artists and the business owners who understood with a merchant's instinct that culture was also commerce. Blanche Lazelle came and pioneered white-line woodblock printing. European exiles brought Cubism, Fauvism, Expressionism to a fishing village at the edge of the Atlantic. In nearby Truro, Edward Hopper became a seasonal resident, painting the spare, melancholic landscapes that would define an American vision of loneliness. Michael Cunningham would later call Provincetown the Morocco of America, the New Orleans of the North. And then in 1903, something happened on a windy cliff in South Wellfleet that had nothing to do with art or tourism, but changed the world. Guglielmo Marconi, a 29-year-old Italian inventor, had built a wireless telegraph station on the high bluffs. 4 wooden towers, 210 feet tall, connected by copper wire, powered by kerosene engines generating 25,000 volts. On the night of January 18, 1903, the air was cold and perfectly clear. Marconi tapped out a message in Morse code from President Theodore Roosevelt to King Edward VII of England. It praised the triumph of wireless telegraphy and extended cordial greetings. The station at Poldhu, England, picked it up directly, no relay needed, and sent back the King's reply. It was the first 2-way transatlantic wireless communication, and it happened from a sandbank in Massachusetts. 9 years later, when the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, it was a Marconi wireless operator who sent the distress signal, and the Wellfleet station that helped relay the message to the Carpathia, which rescued over 700 survivors. After the disaster, an international convention mandated that all ships carrying 50 or more passengers had to carry a Marconi radio. The station that made this possible stood on a cliff that was already eroding. It was shut down in 1917, dismantled by 1920. Today, much of the cliff where those towers stood has fallen into the ocean. The National Park Service maintains a small overlook at the site. There is a scale model, a bronze bust, and a view of the Atlantic from the exact spot where the 20th century's most important communication technology was proven viable, a spot that is measurably smaller every year. But the infrastructure project that truly remade Cape Cod was not wireless or rail. It was a ditch. The idea of cutting a canal across the base of the Cape had been floating around since 1623, when Miles Standish noticed that two rivers, the Manamet flowing into Buzzards Bay and the Scusset flowing into Cape Cod Bay, were separated by only about a mile of land. George Washington commissioned a feasibility study in 1776. Various companies tried and failed for over 2 centuries, defeated by money, politics, or geology. In 1883, the Cape Cod Ship Canal Company managed to dredge nearly a mile of channel through the Sandwich Marshes before going bankrupt in 1891. The man who finally got it done was August Belmont, Jr., and his biography alone tells you something about the scale of ambition involved. Belmont was a Wall Street financier who had built New York City's first subway, the Interborough Rapid Transit, completed in 1904. He'd built Belmont Park Racetrack. His maternal grandfather was Commodore Matthew Perry, who had been born on a farm that lay directly in the path of the proposed canal. In 1904, Belmont acquired the charter for the canal company. He hired William Barclay Parsons, the engineer who designed the subway, and issued $12 million in bonds to finance the work. Construction began in June 1909. The main problem wasn't quicksand, as the engineers had feared, but thousands of enormous boulders buried in the glacial soil, the same debris the ice sheet had left behind 18,000 years earlier. Divers had to blow them up with dynamite one by one, a slow and dangerous process that extended construction by 2 years. 6 workers died. 26 vessels, tugboats, barges, dredges, worked simultaneously at the height of construction. Houses, roads, railroad tracks, and an entire cemetery had to be relocated. On July 29, 1914, the Cape Cod Canal opened with a parade of ships. The steamer Rose Standish led the way. Among the dignitaries was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Belmont had achieved his personal objective, opening the Cape Cod Canal 17 days before the Panama Canal opened. It was a private toll waterway, and Belmont expected it to make a fortune. It didn't. The canal was too narrow, the currents too swift, the tolls too high. Serious accidents caused closures. Mariners feared the passage. Belmont's canal, the engineering triumph of a titan, never turned a real profit. By the 1920s, it was clear the federal government would have to take over. Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to acquire the canal in 1928. They widened it, deepened it, and in 1935 built the 2 bridges, the Bourne and the Sagamore, that remain to this day the only road connections between Cape Cod and the rest of Massachusetts. Those bridges, they are the choke point through which everything on Cape Cod passes. Every tourist, every worker, every delivery truck, every ambulance. 4 lanes each, 10 feet wide, no median, no shoulder. During a summer Friday afternoon, the backup on Route 3 approaching the Sagamore can stretch for miles. The drive from Boston, normally 90 minutes, can take 4 hours. Both bridges are now over 90 years old. The Bourne is rated structurally deficient. The Sagamore is fair. The Army Corps recommended replacement in 2020. The estimated cost? $4.5 billion. Construction on the new Sagamore began in 2026. Funding for the Bourne replacement remains uncertain. If the money doesn't come through, the alternative is a costly rehabilitation that would create a traffic bottleneck lasting months, possibly years, on the only road in or out of a peninsula that generates nearly $3 billion a year in tourism revenue. It was into this landscape, the canal dug, the bridges built, the hotels multiplying, that the Kennedy family arrived. In 1926, Joseph P. Kennedy was 38 years old and already a millionaire. He'd been living in Brookline, Massachusetts, and renting a summer home in Cohasset on the South Shore. He and Rose loved to play golf. He was put up for membership at the Cohasset Country Club. And he was blackballed, apparently for being Irish Catholic. A lot of American history pivoted on that decision. Instead of settling into a wealthy enclave closer to Boston, Kennedy began looking elsewhere. He found the Hyannisport Club, a golf club managed by an Irish Catholic, where he was welcomed. That summer, he rented the Malcolm Cottage, a large house at the end of Marchant Avenue in Hyannisport. 2 years later, he bought it for $25,000. The house became the nucleus of the Kennedy compound, 6 acres of waterfront on Nantucket Sound, eventually encompassing homes for Joseph and Rose, for Jack, for Bobby. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, Hyannisport became the campaign's summer headquarters. The media descended. Photographs of the Kennedys sailing, playing touch football, lounging on the lawn. These images did more for Cape Cod tourism than any advertising campaign ever had or ever would. The quiet village became the summer White House. Locals had mixed feelings. The traffic was punishing. The gawkers were relentless. Among some of the old money summer residents, wasps from Pennsylvania and the Midwest, the Malcolm Cottage was known, before it became famous, as the Irish House. But Kennedy's most lasting contribution to Cape Cod wasn't glamour, it was legislation. In 1954, the National Park Service conducted a survey of the eastern seaboard and found that only 6.5% of the coastal land was in state or federal hands. Development was accelerating. On Cape Cod, the outer beaches, the great stretch from Chatham to Provincetown, were still largely wild, but it was clear they wouldn't stay that way without intervention. In 1958, Senators Kennedy and Leverett Saltonstall introduced a bill to create a National Seashore. It faced fierce opposition from property owners, developers, and longtime residents who saw it as a federal land grab. The bill failed. Kennedy was elected president. On the first day of the 87th Congress, January 3, 1961, Massachusetts representatives reintroduced the bill. The Senate passed it unanimously on June 27th. On August 7, 1961, 7 months after moving into the White House, Kennedy signed the Cape Cod National Seashore into law, using 22 pens, one for each dignitary present. $16 million was authorized to acquire land across 6 towns. It was the first time the federal government had created a national park primarily from private land. The so-called Cape Cod model, months of hearings, compromises between private and public interests, provisions allowing existing homeowners to keep their properties, became the template for future national seashores. The National Seashore today encompasses 44,000 acres, dunes, marshes, ponds, forests, and 40 miles of open beach. It draws nearly 4 million visitors a year and generates $754 million in economic output for the surrounding communities. Kennedy's stated goal was to preserve the Cape for the inspiration and enjoyment of people all over the United States. By any measure, he succeeded. But the preservation also froze the development patterns of 1961 in amber. On the outer Cape, you could not build. And on the rest of the Cape, the zoning codes, shaped by decades of single-family suburban ideals and a fierce attachment to Cape Cod character, ensured that almost nothing except single-family homes would be built. Today, nearly 80% of Cape Cod's housing stock is single-family. There are almost no apartment buildings, almost no duplexes, almost no missing middle housing of the kind that allows a cook or a teacher to live near the restaurant or school where they work. The Mid-Cape Highway, Route 6, built between 1950 and 1959, completed the transformation. Automobiles now had a direct, fast route from the Sagamore Bridge to Orleans. The population surged. Between 1950 and 1990, Cape Cod's year-round population nearly tripled, going from roughly 70,000 to over 200,000. Summer populations doubled or tripled on top of that. The motels went up, the cottages multiplied, the clam shacks and miniature golf courses and ice cream stands opened by the hundreds. By the 1980s, the pace of development was alarming enough that the state created the Cape Cod Commission to manage growth and protect the water supply. The Cape's only source of fresh water is a single underground aquifer recharged by rain, and every septic tank and lawn fertilizer on the peninsula drains into it. And then something shifted. The very mechanisms that had been designed to protect Cape Cod, the National Seashore, the zoning codes, the Commission's growth management, the sheer desirability of the place, began to produce consequences that nobody had quite anticipated. The housing market tightened slowly at first, then all at once. For decades, Cape Cod homeowners had rented out their places for the summer, a tradition as old as tourism on the peninsula. The rental income helped year-round residents cover their mortgages, and it ensured that at least some housing turned over seasonally. But when Airbnb and VRBO arrived in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the calculus changed overnight. A homeowner could now make far more renting to tourists by the week than leasing to a local family by the year. A house that might rent for $1,500 a month to a young couple became a $3,000 a week summer listing. Landlords who had once rented 9-month leases to workers began converting to short-term vacation rentals. The year-round rental stock shrank. The workers who staffed the restaurants, cleaned the hotels, and manned the fire trucks had fewer and fewer places to live. Then the pandemic hit. Remote work liberated high-income professionals from their offices in Boston and New York. Cape Cod, with its beaches and charm and broadband, became irresistible. Between 2020 and 2022, Barnstable County gained nearly 7,000 new permanent residents, while the rest of Massachusetts hemorrhaged population. Home prices, already elevated, went vertical. From January 2019 to September 2022, the median price of a single-family home on Cape Cod rose by an estimated 69%. Bidding wars became routine. Cash offers from out-of-state buyers, many of whom intended to use the properties as second homes or short-term rentals, crowded out local families. A 2024 ranking of second home destinations found that Cape Cod had 15 second homes for every 10 year-round residences, the highest ratio in the country. Second place was Gulf County, Florida, with 7 to 10. The Cape wasn't just popular, it was in a category of its own, and the consequences rippled outward in ways that a real estate statistic alone can't capture. The labor force is collapsing. The Cape is losing over 800 households a year of people making $100,000 or less. Fire departments can't hire. Schools can't recruit teachers. Restaurants that once opened 7 days a week now close on Mondays and Tuesdays because they can't staff a kitchen. The median age on Cape Cod hit 51.8 by 2016, among the highest in the nation, and the population between 25 and 44 dropped by nearly 30% in a single decade. School enrollment has fallen 14%. In some outer Cape towns, the proportion of residents under 18 has dipped below 12%. There are neighborhoods in Wellfleet and Truro where, outside of July and August, you will not find a child. The irony is suffocating in its completeness. The Cape's tourism economy, $1.5 billion by the Chamber of Commerce's measure of direct hospitality impact, and considerably more when you add in all visitor spending, depends entirely on workers. Someone has to pour the drinks, clean the rooms, staff the shops, drive the shuttle buses. Those workers need somewhere to live. But the tourism economy has made living there unaffordable, and the zoning that preserves the character that tourists come to see, the shingled cottages, the village greens, the absence of apartment blocks, is the very thing that prevents the construction of affordable housing. It's a closed loop. The beauty creates the demand creates the prices. The prices eliminate the workforce. The workforce shortage degrades the experience. The experience is all there is. And underneath all of it, literally, the ground is moving. Cape Cod loses an average of 3 to 4 feet of outer shoreline to erosion every year, though in some spots, particularly the high bluffs of the National Seashore, the rate is 12 to 15 feet. The ocean does not negotiate, as one coastal geographer put it. Sea levels along the east coast are projected to rise 10 to 14 inches over the next 30 years. Storm surges are intensifying. The nor'easters that have always hammered the Cape are arriving with more force, chewing through dunes, undermining parking lots, toppling the edges of cliffs. At Herring Cove Beach in Provincetown, the National Park Service recently completed what it calls a strategic retreat. A new parking lot built 200 feet inland from the old one. A new bathhouse set on pilings so it can be picked up and moved again in a few decades. New dune grass planted in rows like crops to hold the sand in place. The project cost $3 million and is, by design, temporary. The ocean will take this, too. It's a question of when, not whether. The Marconi station site in Wellfleet, where the first transatlantic wireless message was sent, where the signal that helped save 700 Titanic survivors originated, is now a sandy overlook with informational plaques and a dwindling shelf of bluff. Half the land that existed when Marconi built his towers in 1901 has fallen into the Atlantic. The peninsula at that point is barely a mile wide. You can stand at the overlook and see both the ocean and the bay. You are standing on the thinning edge of a geological comma that was never meant to be permanent. And now the sharks have arrived, or rather returned. For most of the 20th century, great white sharks were rare enough off Cape Cod to be extraordinary. But after the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, gray seal populations rebounded explosively, establishing massive colonies near Monomoy Island and other barrier beaches. Where seals haul out, great whites follow. Between 2015 and 2018, researchers identified approximately 800 individual white sharks in Cape Cod waters. It is now one of the densest seasonal great white hotspots in the world. Beaches close regularly when sharks are spotted, sometimes as close as 30 feet from the sand. In 2018, a bodyboarder named Arthur Medici was fatally attacked at Newcomb Hollow Beach in Wellfleet, the first fatal shark attack in Massachusetts in 80 years. The sharks haven't killed tourism. If anything, they've added a new kind of attraction. Shark watching tours out of Chatham charge up to $3,500 for a multi-hour experience. The Atlantic White Shark Conservancy has turned research into a visitor draw. The Sharktivity app sends real-time sighting alerts to beachgoers' phones. But the sharks have changed the experience. On the Outer Cape's magnificent ocean beaches, the ones Thoreau walked, the ones Kennedy preserved, swimming is now a calculated risk. Purple flags fly. Lifeguards carry tourniquets. Children are told to stay in knee-deep water. The seals that drew the sharks lounge on the sand in enormous barking herds, and the great whites cruise the surf line behind them, shadows in the green water, usually invisible, always present. Cape Cod today generates $2.8 billion a year in visitor spending. Local option occupancy taxes brought in $90 million for Cape Cod towns in 2024 alone, a 12% increase in a single year. The National Seashore supports over 5,000 jobs. The Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce is quick to point out that between April and September, 47% of all spending at local businesses comes from visitors. Without tourism, the property tax burden on year-round residents would be crushing. But the model is straining at every joint. The bridges are failing. The housing is unaffordable. The workforce is evaporating. The coastline is eroding. The water supply is threatened by nitrogen from tens of thousands of septic systems. The population is aging out. 86% of the Cape's land is already developed, and the thing that makes Cape Cod valuable, its beauty, its wildness, its character, cannot be replicated, cannot be manufactured, and is not, as the rising sea keeps reminding everyone, guaranteed. Provincetown remains America's oldest continuous art colony. The galleries on Commercial Street still draw serious collectors. The light still falls the way Hawthorne described it. The fishing fleet still goes out from McMillan Wharf. The dune shacks in the National Seashore, The ones where Eugene O'Neill and Jack Kerouac and Norman Mailer worked still stand, though a few are closer to the water than they used to be. Provincetown has also become one of the most celebrated LGBTQ destinations in the country. Its bohemian history a direct line from the artists and writers who first came for the freedom as much as the scenery. But Provincetown, too, is caught in the vice. Short-term rentals have hollowed out the year-round population. The town commissioned a study in 2023 looking at the impact of platforms like Airbnb on housing stock. The findings were what everyone already knew. Owners had been renting their vacation homes on a short-term basis since the early 1900s. But the apps made it so easy and so lucrative that the conversion accelerated beyond anything local policy could contain. Provincetown's year-round population has been dwindling. The restaurants that once defined the scene now struggle to find staff willing to live in a town where a studio apartment, if you can find one, might cost more than a mortgage payment in most of America. In April 2025, the Barnstable County Assembly of Delegates voted 14-1 to formally declare a housing crisis on Cape Cod. It was both a symbolic gesture and a genuine cry for help. The resolution laid out the numbers: stagnating construction, ballooning prices, declining population, a workforce in freefall, and called for regional solutions. But Cape Cod isn't one town with one government. It's 15 independent towns, each with its own town meeting, its own zoning board, its own fiercely local politics. Coordinating a regional housing strategy across 15 New England town meetings is roughly as simple as herding cats across a canal in a nor'easter. There is a word that comes up in almost every planning document, every chamber report, every town meeting debate: sustainable. Can Cape Cod sustain its tourism economy? Can it sustain its year-round communities? Can it sustain its coastline? The word implies a steady state, a balance point. The idea that if the right policies are adopted, the right investments made, the right compromises reached, things can continue more or less as they are. But the geology doesn't work that way. Cape Cod is not a permanent feature of the eastern seaboard. It is a landform in transit. The sand that makes the beaches moves with every tide, every storm, every inch of sea level rise. The place the Pilgrims rejected because it was too sandy is still, 400 years later, defined and threatened by that sand. It shifts beneath the foundations, washes out from under the bluffs, fills in the harbors, and reforms as barrier beaches somewhere else. The Cape Cod of 2026 is not the same shape as the Cape Cod of 1920, which was not the same shape as the Cape Cod of 1620. The Bourne Bridge opened on June 22, 1935, with a ceremony and a parade. The Sagamore opened 4 months later. They were engineering marvels of their time, concrete arches spanning the widened canal, finally giving automobiles a direct route onto the Cape. 91 years later, construction crews are driving pilings for the Sagamore's replacement, a new arched span with wider lanes, a median, shoulders, a pedestrian walkway with, reportedly, a sunset overlook. The estimated completion date is years away. The Bourne replacement is further behind, its funding uncertain. When both new bridges are finished, if they are finished, Cape Cod will have its first modern road connection to the mainland in nearly a century. On a Friday afternoon in July, the backup still stretches for miles. The cars inch forward, bumper to bumper, air conditioning running, kids in the back seat asking how much longer. At the front of the line, the old bridge waits. 4 narrow lanes, no shoulders, a single flat tire away from gridlock. And beyond it, the sand.